Hello, and welcome to About Sustainability, a podcast brought to you by the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, or IGES for short. I'm Alice, your host for this episode, and today we'll talk about the just transition with two researchers from IGES, So-Young Lee from the Integrated Sustainability Center and Dwayne Appleby from the Sustainable Consumption and Production team. We'll explore what the just transition means, tracing its roots back to labor movements of the 1970s and its evolution into international debates and sustainable frameworks. Our guests will share innovative case studies that showcase how just transition principles are being implemented locally across the world, with a special focus on Asia, and discuss ongoing challenges and successes. So let's dive into today's discussion, where I first asked what exactly we mean by a just transition. I feel like this has been a topic that I've been hearing a lot in climate, environmental discussions. I keep hearing about it and it kind of makes sense. It is something that I feel is probably morally right, but then I find it hard to really understand what it means practically in terms of both what's on the ground, but also how it is translated into policies. So if you could just enlighten me about what this term means and where it comes from.
I think this is a tricky question, and I think that this is, from my view, where the global discussion right now is stuck. Because we all know that we need to think about a just transition. It sounds great. Of course, we want the transition to net zero or climate, whatever we call it, to be just. We want it to be inclusive and all of these things. But, what does that mean to different people from different countries, from different economic classes, different backgrounds? It's a difficult question. The thing that's kind of agreed upon is that just transition as a concept started maybe in the 1970s, 1980s in the United States as this kind of labor movement from trade unions that were facing kind of transitions within their industries, from disruption from information communication technology, digitization, the early .com period, but also globalization. And so jobs were disappearing and moving, and trade unions were, rightly so, advocating for their workers to be taken care of during that transition. So thinking about, everything from retraining, pensions, loss of social status, thinking about retirements, ongoing livelihoods, all of these things needed to be considered. And so the roots of just transition as a topic are very much in the labor movement. And I think today we still see that it is largely rooted in discussions of the workplace and livelihoods and jobs, but we're seeing it spread into the larger context. And so there's kind of two parallel discussions happening at the same time, whether or not we're strictly focusing on economic transition, transitioning the really high carbon industries, the energy sector, or if we're also saying, no, let's look and make the transition, the social transition, the economy-wide transition just. Yeah, there's these multiple tensions that are happening.
The only thing I want to cover is that, it has to be emphasized a lot on job creation, decent job and green, decent quality jobs for those who might, lose their workplaces, especially those in fossil-related sectors. So that's the main kind of, focus. But from a larger, bigger perspective, the concept of this just transition must extend it, beyond securing those decent jobs. That's, I think, what we need to understand much further. It's because, as I'm the environmental sociologist, when there was those construction of development in power plants in very first place. The local fisheries or small farmers, for instance, they've lost many of their livelihood and they didn't realize what's the potential side effects, in very first place. And also they had no strong connection at all to access any political channels, right? To present their voices like a labor union. Labor union actually has quite a strong voice now. So, I mean, the issue I think we have is that how we should and can expand the concept of just transition, which has been highlighted recently.
So you mean we should expand it to beyond just talking about workers' rights, right? So what exactly should that include?
I mean, I'm happy to see nowadays, the latest analysis on just transition. I think Dwayne would agree that it allows more open space for developing much easy to say the interdisciplinary approach to generate justice-oriented formation. That often take the frameworks of environmental injustice narratives, which I'm most familiar with, like, distributive justice and procedural justice, and so on. And to me, the recognition justice has to be highlighted the most because the negative impacts of this climate change are experienced very differently, right, across place, time, and also the socioeconomic status. So it's easy to the government make decisive policy to provide jobs to the workers. But if, they have to expand all these, different types of climate change impacts, it would be difficult. So I can understand why it has been focused in certain sector for the net zero development, but it shouldn't be limited only in that sector and only in certain group of people. That's my point.
I'm so happy that you brought up, kind of these different types of justice, different approaches to the way that we think about it. Because I think, and you're exactly right that, we need to focus, governments, large governments, state level governments can focus on, job creation, these large policies. But when it comes down to the local level, we need to start thinking more about participatory justice, representative, all of these different things that allow for multiple pathways to achieving just transition. And I wonder, and maybe we'll talk about this a bit later, that it makes me think that, some of the global level policy discussions, as much as I feel that, maybe with the term just transition, we're in the same position that maybe the term environment was at in 1990 or something, where you look at a textbook and you have a list of things to consider, politics, economics, et cetera, and then it's always at the end, and environment. And now today it seems, net zero, circular, all of these things, and just transition, and it's kind of tacked on to the end. But we have it in Paris, the Paris Agreement, in COP decisions or discussions, and I think that this, we run the risk of having these large policies that don't allow for enough space for creative input and participatory input at the local level that actually will, I think, allow just transition to really manifest. I think that there's too much, maybe it's too negative for me to say, but it feels like, there's politics gets in the way of it. Kind of global power politics, the histories of imperialism, colonialism, etc., who's responsible for what. I think that all of that can get us bogged down at the higher level. Whereas at the local level, I think people can very easily see, what they need, and what types of actions they would like to see. And yeah, so as long as the kind of the theory of or the practice of creating a just transition is participatory, I think maybe some of that can be mitigated. Yeah.
I think you just mentioned the Paris Agreement, the COPs that have been starting to include this language in most of their texts, and I think it's a recent move, right? So I'm just kind of wondering, why hasn't this always been the case?
When we look at justice, I think there's an aspect of whether or not we're coming at this from this utilitarian perspective or libertarian perspective, if I can kind of do a bipolar mapping of it. At the global level, this is essentially what's determining, you know, what is possible and why we haven't been working on it in the past. Because there are many countries who are more libertarian that would say, well, the proper role of government, is to just provide open space for people to be as free as possible. And so that affects taxation, which affects the resources that governments can put towards certain things. It also affects whether or not citizens think that it is the role of government to step in and say, these are bad. There are some countries, European Union is very happy to take a more collectivist utilitarian perspective and say, sure, let's tax, let's work together, let's do all these things. Some other countries, my country included, Canada, more libertarian, less likely to want to, prescribe what people can do. And so I think there's these clashing views, and more so now with the emerging large economies, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, et cetera, Indonesia. They also have different perspectives and different pathways into this. So it's it's literally and figuratively, we're speaking different languages and coming at it from different perspectives. I think that has led to some of this gridlock and this hesitation to actually take action on it.
I think it's really, really important question, Alice, you've raised, that why now, right? Why now just transition? I mean, that was exactly the same question I've raised myself, that, why now? Because it's been for long that the sociologists tend to put environment at the end always, when we are talking about justice issues, equity issues. But to me, as the environmental sociologist, environment came always the first, because, like intra-generational environmental injustice, dimension, when we talk about that, it's very basic concept that, that covers the fair distribution of natural resources between, different socioeconomic status. And they will get, they should have fair distribution of environmental impacts, right? So between class, race, gender, and so on, within the specific country and society. But well, when I say that, that's environmental injustice, that form of social justices, there is no big difference, that refers the distribution of natural resources and also, externalities among the groups of people within certain country, within certain society. That's exactly the same as what's happening with social injustice issues. So it's the same. There is not that much of difference, but I think Dwayne also addressed this part, is that there has been historical imbalance in resource distribution, not only within country, within a certain society, but between nations and regions. So there is the global north and south, and we say environmental colonialism, and that's the fact. And if we can expand further, I mean, beyond this current generation, I mean, even we can talk about those population might affect, would be the worst is, we say, future generations, right? So in this case, the climate crisis, they might get affected much worse than the current generation. This is for sure, as long as we believe climate crisis is really affecting. And they have least able to influence any policy processes at all, or they have no, chance to influence any policy processes. So we can say this is intergenerational injustice between the current and next generation. So, if we can expand further and further these environmental injustice issues, we can extend even, to the ecological injustice issues. So, justice between species, right? So what I want to say is that we really need to recognize the intrinsic value of all other species. Then it goes further and further. But if we need to limit within our, justice, within this current human society, the justice issues, if we have to limit. But my concern is that at the just transition, the current concept still need to expand much further. Even it doesn't go to North and Southern or any kind of discussion between the current and next or between the species. It has to consider those pre-existing inequalities, because that has been recurring. That's never solved, and that's actually recurring under this net zero development model. I think that's very, serious issue, because it's almost the same narratives. Since we focus on technological transition development only, focused on and only receives the most attention. And if we keep the almost same way of path, then how can we really consider this is just and fair transition? If things remain same.
Yeah, this seems really, really complex, and it makes it harder for me to understand exactly who is most vulnerable to this transition, who are the losers, and who are the people who need to compensate the others because they might be the winners of this transition. Because you also mentioned that it was affected by past inequalities, and how do we understand that this transition is an added stressor to these inequalities? How do you differentiate that, and how can we have a system that fairly compensates the losers, and how do we make sure that the winners recognize that they're benefiting from this transition and make sure that everyone is a similar standpoint and that no one is left behind?
I can say that many those technological solutions somewhat produced unsustainable environmental, social, ethical risks. That's what I can point out. So if you want to identify them as the losers, it's up to you. But I can say that, for instance, there is a trade-offs that associated with this deployment of renewables. Massive renewables. I'm emphasizing massive renewables here for the rapid decarbonization that have been replicated pre-existing injustice. As I mentioned before, it's land grabbing is there, and all those locals' rights, the loss of their livelihoods and so on because of this massive commercial solar complex. I don't know who could be the winner and loser. I can clearly see who is the loser, but who can be the winner? My question I can raise myself is that why do we consuming this much energy and resources keep encouraging this globalization, urbanization, mass consumption? Why do we push ourselves to ever greater energy resource use? Even we see all these inequity issues are there.
Some of the challenge of deciding who's winning and losing, as So Young pointed out, is really dependent on how we frame this. What do we consider to be winning? Is winning just having more money? Like we exist in a capitalist system, and so that's how we determine success: wealth generation, accumulation. And so we could have, transitions that, Alice, you and I have, worked on some frameworks of, one planet living, right? That in those framings, it requires a radical rethink of things like sufficiency. So getting at what So Young was saying, why do we need to keep pushing for more and more and more consumption, more globalization, more energy production? The economy has, seems to have a momentum of its own, and in some ways, it drags the rest of us along with it. But just transition provides perhaps an opportunity for us to rethink that. But we're dealing with people, and we all have different motivations. We all have different aspirations for the future. Again, coming back to this discussion about historical inequalities, historical injustices that have set up these, systems where we have expectations, we have these entrenched relationships, and that really it's creating the boundaries past which we seem to not be able to see, or at least policymakers. I shouldn't say we. Many researchers, practitioners on the ground, some policymakers can see beyond and to start to, imagine something different. But I think for many policymakers, they exist within the system as it is. And so it's difficult for them to see outside of it. They do see winners and losers maybe as people who come out economically ahead. Do you have more employment? Do you have greater GDP? Do you have, these types of things that tells them, we're winners. When you look back at when globalization was happening and you have jobs moving overseas and, for example, North America stopped, manufacturing things and sent manufacturing overseas. And that was initially seen as, we're losing jobs, but then people made a lot more money. Well, I shouldn't say individuals, but overall GDP went up. And so people said, oh, it's a great success. And maybe that, on paper, that's true. But if you go to certain communities that used to exist and they're gone now, they had been there for 300 years or something, and now they're gone. And that strikes us in that sense of fairness. As we look at the just transition, we need to think about fairness as well, because we're dealing with people. Of course, now I'm going to contradict myself and say that there are people who would say, well, who cares what people think? The planet has hard limits and it doesn't matter. All we're doing is managing the transition as well as we can. But, the limits are the limits, and, the planet will force us into alignment. But I think, yeah, I don't know. It's a really difficult challenge, and how do we determine winners and losers? It's anyone's guess.
The process nowadays I see is that there have been the political process that seems to incorporate the voices of disadvantaged populations, like the indigenous peoples nowadays, it seems like. So there has been the recent discussion on this inclusion. I remember that the UNEP, Indigenous Peoples Major Group, has been acknowledged by the UNEP, and they put the Indigenous peoples' vital role in the decision-making process. So it seems like, there is a procedural justice has been recognized, it seems like. And the 22 values assessment from IPPAS, and I saw that covered the Indigenous people's diverse values. The values with nature and their historical connections to the resources. And I think that's a good, that they somewhat started to include, I don't want to say losers, but the marginalized voices. But I'm sorry, I'm so I shouldn't be this much cynical, but I'm not that much fully convinced, because those indigenous knowledges picked up might be, to me, it's collected for those not the winners, but those current, dominant groups, rather than, that is really well represent of the indigenous people's true values. So I'm just worried.
Where I grew up in British Columbia in Canada, we have many indigenous groups. Canada has a really horrific history of the way we treated the indigenous people, and so I'll preface it by saying that. But I will also say, So Young, that I don't think you're being too cynical, based on my own experience of watching what has happened in Canada. That yeah, there is a lot of movement to kind of include indigenous voices, or to bring in what is it called, like tech, traditional environmental knowledge or some, but it does tend to, what's the word? It tends to be a fetishization of indigenous peoples and their lifestyles and what colonizers view. We have this idealized, vision that goes back to this, very Western view of maybe very British view of the noble savage. That's it's deeply
Yeah.
insulting. But it's, now this new one is kind of, it looks a little nicer, but it seems to me to be a lot of lip service. There's not a lot of substance there. It's performative. Um, and so I think, yeah, on the one hand, it is encouraging to see at least more people being brought to the table, but and that is definitely a prerequisite for any type of just transition. But at the same time, yeah, I'm also highly cynical.
Yeah, so it shouldn't only be about people being included at the table, and it should also be about them actually having an agency, actually having control over how they want to decide their future, and yeah, having the capacity to do that. How are we making sure that people have that sort of agency? Are there policies or actions that we can look towards that can be potentially modeled after? I know that most of the time we have to do this case by case, and we have to tailor this to every community's needs, every country's different interests. But at the same time, I'm wondering, is there a success story that we can be inspired by, or?
I mean, I feel like maybe So Young, tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel that this is a kind of another example where my response is kind of like, not really. We're not really seeing it. It's yeah, I feel like people are uh, except at the local level. I will say this, local level is something a little bit different. And I think we could talk about some examples here in Japan that are good examples, like in Kamikatsu, maybe in Shikoku, the zero waste community, like these types of things that are really participatory, deeply rooted in place, responding to local needs, empowering people, the elders, young, all of this. It's really great. But I think, yeah, at these kind of larger levels, I don't see us, yeah, really supporting actual concrete policies or activities yet. I think it's still a lot of discussion, and a lot of that discussion, unfortunately, I feel is people talking past each other because we don't have a shared idea of what a just transition is. Is it just economy? Is it social? Is it intergenerational? As So Young was saying, this is so important to be thinking of this intergenerational aspect, and it seems like it's not. We're not quite there yet in terms of concrete discussions on the part of at least elected officials.
I think we know what not to do, but it's hard to know what exactly should be the roadmap to have a properly just transition. I think a very famous example of what not to do is the gilets jaunes, or the yellow vests in France, where the governments wanted to implement a carbon tax, and then they realized that that was affecting much more of the sectors that were dependent on the transportation system that was not public, like their individual transportation system. And that meant that it was going to be a huge burden on those households and those individuals. And then it led to a lot of protests. But then one good thing that came out of it, I think, is understanding that everyone understands that we have to do this transition, that we all have to pay for it, but you have to know what you're paying for. You have to know what direction you're going towards. And then at the time, it was just, okay, let's adopt this transition towards a decarbonized society. So some people have to pay for this carbon, but then you're not really quite sure what you're going to invest this into. So that meant that a lot of people were just seeing the price that they were paying without really seeing the benefits that they would get out of it in the future. So it should probably also be about having a common understanding of the future you want as a society or as a community.
Mm. I think you touched on something I think really important there as well. Like as we have discussions and continue to have more discussions about just transitions, a really important part is when I say we, I mean policymakers, but also researchers, when we talk to the public about just transition, I mean, we need to be really clear about what to expect. I think a lot of that I've read, maybe from like UNDP, UNEP, et cetera, they talk about the opportunity, right? They talk about the opportunity of the green transformation, new clean jobs, better this, better that, all of these things, but they don't mention that, with this new creation will come destruction. It does need to happen. It's very Schumpeterian, kind of this creative destruction model of innovation and economic development and social change, which means, yes, there will be losers. There will be people who lose their job in the short term, or industries that disappear, ways of life that disappear as well. And so, we need to be very clear in discussing that, because I think we see increasingly, certainly across the West, that citizenries are increasingly distrustful of their governments. They don't believe what they hear because they, maybe feel that they're only getting one side of a story, or not even one side, half of a side. They're just getting a very narrow slice, that they're being told what someone thinks they want to hear. Therefore, they're not empowered to really understand what's going on and take action based on that, to actually truly participate in it. The current political and economic models encourage people to disconnect from that. And it then leaves us with a situation, perhaps, do we try and find a way to get to a just transition that relies on market mechanisms? I mean, that sounds crazy. Like, you can't buy your way into a just transition. You can't, rely on just economic models or just incentives. It needs to be something broader based, because I think, and maybe So Young, maybe you'll agree with this, that the I guess the fundamental premise of a just transition is, we need to transition to something that is just, because what we have right now is not. What we have right now is not just. We have increasing inequality. We have disparities, both historical, present, emerging. We don't have anything approaching equity, and we don't have anything that approaches an intergenerational view on these things. And yeah, well, that was depressing. I'm sorry, but I think that's maybe where we're sitting. And trying to figure out, how can we move forward in ways that are smart, but they need to be inclusive. They need to be transparent. Even if, what we're communicating about, jobs or communities maybe is perceived as negative right now. That, we need to have the difficult conversation, I guess is what I'm saying.
I agree. I mean, I couldn't agree more that there is no kind of national level of successful stories yet, I see, but locals and maybe city level at least, there is a tendency that in this environmental and climate governance field area, that we do position that Western, knowledge, Western development practice as the only base for global environmental policy and solutions. And we have been ignoring there are various local values, and that's the missing part. And we wanna reform this unsustainable system. So I'm not, anti-Western, or I'm not Occidentalist, but it's important at this moment when we are talking about more fair, just transition from now on. I don't think we need to stick with this the concept of universal. I mean, there are pluriverse, right? Pluriverse worldview. There are thousands, millions of local values we have forgotten, and that will help us to rethink our system, society, and relationship with others. So it's not just me, but many grassroots activists, practitioners, and there are so many of us have been developed and brought back the important values. When I was writing my thesis, I was seeking the alternatives. I lived in eco-villages, and I was with those people of grid outside of this system. And my supervisor, he is strong Marxist, and I respect him. But he was telling me that I have to think about the systematic change rather than those scattered alternative ideas. But after 25 years later, now I see even the dictionary of pluriverse. This is written by Kotari. He's famous in Indian, I think, activist. He has edited a book, Pluriverse, a dictionary, and it has list of ideas in there. So I can see the eco-village is one of them. And from A to Z, there are plenty of ideas. It has alternative currencies. Buddhism is there. Buen vivir in Ecuador is there. Commons, community economies, co-ops, deep ecology, degrowth, eco-anarchism, ecofeminism, and food sovereignty. Environmental justice is also there. Gross national happiness, Bhutan. Islamic ethics is there. Kyosei, I think it's Japanese term. Kyosei is also here. And what else? Localization, permaculture, rural reconstruction, slow movement, social ecology. Tao worldview is also there. Transition movement, and Zapatista autonomy is in Mexico is the in that it's the last. I mean, the listeners of this podcast can, I think, look for. I mean, these diverse of alternative ideas. We've lived, to follow one development path. And that seems like, one answer that we believed in. But, there are huge number of people who was not able to be part of that us, or willing to be outside of that, we. And I have strong hope with the people outside of that, path. And I believe there are majority of people who want to be outside of that system, but don't know what to do. So, I mean, it's good to reform the system to work sustainable and fair. It's okay. But, I want to say that okay shouldn't dominate the other values and ideas. I mean, being belief in this current system is okay. If you want to stay in there, that's fine. If you want to try to develop and reform that's also fine. But that shouldn't be the only way of living. There are plenty of, many hundreds, thousands, millions of ways of ideas and solutions and innovations. Then, if we can just extend our perspective from one to plural, then you can find the answer that fits to you. Then you can follow that path.
I think this is so valuable to discuss this type of thing. And I think it reminds me of some previous work that I did actually before I joined IGES, but in collaboration with IGES, talking about kind of future visions of a good life. And, like So Young, you're so right when you say that, probably a majority of people don't really want to live in the system the way it is. They would rather have some alternative. Okay, it's okay to, yeah, revise the system a little bit, to reform, to tinker at the edges, raise the minimum wage, or change some regulation here or there. Um, but fundamentally, I think a lot of people do want to have a different way of life, and people do have different sets of values. Uh, but as So Young said, we're all reading from the same storybook. We're telling the same story, and it wasn't always this way, which should tell us that it doesn't always have to be that way. And we can see even, maybe just an example from Japan. Of course, I remember this from studying development economics in university that, um, the power of changing the story that you're telling yourself about, your proper place in the world, what is right and wrong, what, the future can hold or not. Is a good example of the Meiji Restoration here in Japan, where the entire country kind of changed its mind and said, no, we're going to try something different. And economic transformation followed. We see as well in Eastern Europe, after the fall of the Soviet Union, many countries there changed their economic model, changed their way of living. Yes, of course, they were changing to the capitalist model, the storybook that we're all now, reading from together. But it does tell us that these types of transformations are possible. And I think that partially, I mean, probably due to, the ease of communicating with each other now, I think many of these ideas that So Young kind of listed out there are spreading. I can think eco-villages are everywhere in the world now. They've created kind of a movement around it that, has some guiding principles, but is largely flexible, and you can make it hyper local. I'm thinking of an organization called BedZed in the United Kingdom that, bioregional, and, they have these intentional communities that are closed loop, circular, and they have now, I think similar communities in dozens of countries around the world. This is something that is possible, and perhaps this also could suggest to us that if we can agree on some type of framework at the higher level of the necessity for just transition, that's integrated with maybe we have to be bureaucratic and policymakers, so we have some targets of emissions and clean water and all of these things. But creating space in there for initiatives like these to nest inside while contributing to those kind of, I guess, meta level goals could be a good solution. Maybe this is one of the, I don't want to be too critical of it, but maybe this is one of the stumbling blocks for the SDGs, is that I feel like there hasn't been enough emphasis on allowing many pathways towards achieving them, unlike with Paris Agreement, with the nationally determined contributions that are a little more flexible.
Yeah, it's good to focus on what works at the very local level and get potentially inspiration, and then hopefully this can be integrated into larger models in the future. I feel like in the past 6 years I've lived in Japan, and I don't really hear the term just transition being used in the policy talks as much as I do in the West or in the international levels. So I'm wondering if there is hesitancy to talk about this, or if there is just a different equivalent, or if we do talk about it and maybe I've just haven't heard of it. So I'm just wondering, how does this term, this concept of just transition apply to Asia as a region? and the different countries within Asia?
I think it has yet received that much of wide attention, I mean, in Asia, of the current concept of just transition. And there was a kind of lack of relevant research that can guide just and sustainable societies in net zero Asia, because, transition is for the net zero to achieve the net zero society. So it hasn't been widely adopted or taught. But as I mentioned before, there has been the scholars, I mean, in this field engaged with the environmental justice, climate justice issues. So, I mean, when the concept of just transition came up since 2018, I think, I mean, I was discussing on the topic with those scholars and started to collect some of those empirical studies in more real-world settings. And luckily enough, I mean, IGES, we had issued the special feature, I mean, that entitled Just and Sustainable Transitions in Net Zero Asia in the Sustainability Science Journal that IGES hosts. And that one presents, I think, well of the diversity, variety of settings, how and the application of that just transition principles is tested and tried in Asia. Somewhat, I think, well addressed these pressing environmental challenges, social inequities, and climate injustice issues. But the thing I found very interesting is that most of those papers, cases are very much dissimilar to the typical cases developed in highly industrialized countries, mostly in the West, because they have had decades of experience of coal phase outs, right? But in Asia, it's not. It's kind of very urgent request. For instance, China, they do have just transition, this terminology itself, in their 5-year plan for 2035. They put just transition integrates social cohesion, rural urban revitalization, and ecological civilization in their 5-year plan. And also China pleaded a net zero target by 2060, and it's extremely ambitious climate commitment. They might face enormous pressure to maintain the energy security, or, when they face the coal use. It occupies, half of the global production and their coal-fired electricity. So it might be huge pressure. And at the same time, this strong government is encouraging very rapid deployment of renewable energies. So another paper has been mentioned that this deployment of rooftop PVs in rural households in China, and they said they found it has been reduced much of the transparency of decision-making process, and also the opportunity of the residents to participate the energy plan. So, I mean, even it's rooftop PV, renewable energies, it's, I mean, exactly the same thing is happening in a country in Asia. And also this kind of, energy policy emphasize too much on monetary incentives and subsidies. So it's just merely increase the energy overconsumption rather than, supporting the vulnerable groups in the communities. So again, I mean, what's the difference between the current energy system and the net zero transition we are asking for? I mean, of course, it would help the mitigate climate change, but apart from it, I mean, what we can see is exactly same thing happening in the real world. And well, in Japan, maybe example of just transition hasn't been really discussed, but the papers I've received from Japan is that one researcher has been working on the just transition approach from energy sector to food system. And then also, in Asia, many areas in Asia, we depend on agricultural lifestyles. And GHG emissions, over 30% of it is produced from agri-food processes. So, and this researcher has been mentioned on urban agriculture that's been promoted for long in Japan and suggests deeper look into the re-evaluation of existing lifestyles and values. This paper was quite encouraging to see how to achieve just and sustainable food system transitions. And another one, again from Japan, was talking about commons. The idea of commons, that justice between, I can say that human society and nature, and how to manage this coastal wetlands that has been destroyed, and suggests the community ownership of commons for the regenerative economy. Yeah, I mean, because as you know that these non-human stakeholders can't speak, right? So there are biodiversity custodians, and often that's local communities, because they have lived in sustainable way with their environment for centuries. So they have better and essential knowledges and practices of these biodiversity conservations. So I think, there's scholars and researchers who work on not specifically the wording of just transition, but justice issues in Asia. I have plenty of optimistic ideas and suggestions. One more paper that I want to emphasize is the empirical analysis of youth climate activism in Korea. And it's been highlighted a lot on equity issues for long. And interesting finding of this study is that these youth, the young generation activists, they request for the solidarity among all disadvantaged, all marginalized segments of Korean society to fight against this existing inequality, not merely for their generation, for next generation's interest, because their understanding of the current generation or the older generation is that, Korea or many of the Asian countries have the history of poverty and, the needs of the rapid development, economic development, to survive, rather than, for their luxury as life, but really for their survival. So somehow, this kind of historical idea has been neutralized current next generation's criticisms. So in this case, the kind of rhetoric we've learned that, there is intergenerational conflicts between current and next generations that less fits adequately in this case. So I think it's interesting findings in there. All those cases reiterate caution against one-size-fits-all approach. So, there are all different, we are different to design the pathways for just transitions, and they all highlight the importance of local context-specific strategies. So I can see, that's how the Asian scholars want to support ecologically sound and socially just transitions in Asia.
Yeah, these are all really great initiatives. And I think it really highlights, as you've said, the fact that in Asia, we might not really have a shared understanding of what the just transition may be for the region as a whole or for each country, but that it's usually about tackling the injustices at the local level and then finding solutions that would be tailored to solving those injustices. And I'm also just quickly wondering, as a last question, to Dwayne, what is your view on what is a just transition in Japan? Like maybe in Japan or in Asia, maybe you have this outsider point of view on what might be different from what you've known back in Canada, or you studied in Europe as well. So what are some peculiarities in Asia?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. I think actually it builds off of many of the thoughts that I was having when So Young was just talking about these different examples. My brain was doing the automatic, comparative analysis and saying, oh no, this would never work in Canada, or no, this would not work in the UK. They would take a completely different perspective on it. And really, I mean, acknowledging as well, So Young said that, many of the case studies and examples that make it into the global discussions, they're the Western examples. And so everybody thinks, oh, you're phasing out coal or phasing out from energy, that means coal. But that's not really relevant to, many Asian context situations. So I think it's really valuable to be acknowledging that there are different experiences in different places, and to say as well that yeah, the majority of the actions, and I've in my brief time here in Japan so far, I've noticed and looking at just transitions that it seems like nationally, prefectural level, etc. I think that the driving force in Japan around just transition is civil society and local government. It's these two that happen kind of hand in hand. And then maybe, once they, get some momentum, once they start seeing some success, then maybe government, local government, city government or prefecture will come in and say, oh, we can help. And they can, add something to it, but it's still being driven by the local champions. Yeah, and I find that really quite interesting because maybe it will not come as a surprise to anyone listening that being from North America, and particularly the West Coast of North America, I'm used to very hyper individualistic societies where you don't want to talk to your neighbors, you don't want to talk to anyone in your town, you have your friends, and you don't really get involved in a lot of community-led things. If there's a problem, you complain to the government, and you want them to fix it. Whereas it seems like here in Japan, there is a deeper culture of community coming together to support one another. And I don't know if that, comes from philosophical differences that Eastern and Western societies have. Western society, our thinking goes back to like Rome and Greece, these philosophical views. And whereas in the East, it's more like, coming down to like Confucianism and Buddhism and these different views. And they do take a radically different perspective on your role in society. And I guess that justice aspect, what do you deserve and what do you owe to society? What are the responsibilities that you have? And so I think from my view, I think I'm more positive. I get a more positive view of potential futures here in Asia, here in Japan, because I see the willingness of people to step forward and help one another instead of thinking, well, if there's a problem, I'll just spend some money or I will try and elect someone who will do something for it and I don't have to engage with it. I think here maybe this is, just me as a foreigner viewing it and I don't really understand what's happening, but it seems like people are more willing to engage. And also, I mean, I see a lot more intergenerational connections here. And that's also very encouraging because part of justice and part of just transition is continuity, right? Is carrying forward traditions, carrying forward society and culture. I think these are the things that give us strength in times when we're being tested, when disruption is happening. I think these are the things that we can rely on, and that means relying on each other. And so, yeah, I don't know if maybe that means that, I think Japan will have a better time of transition than, say, Canada will. But I think there's certainly, reason to be encouraged and hopeful just because of, the engagement of kind of just normal people in their community, being, if it's hyper local or if it's just in Kanagawa or something. But and I'll add one other thing, that there was a case study that I came across looking at just transitions in Japan. It was from Yubari City in Hokkaido. It was a coal town back in, and it kind of shut down. The mine ended in the 70s and 80s. And so, interestingly, it could be a comparative analysis of how a coal mining town transitions in Japan versus the standard one that we hear about in somewhere in Appalachia in North America or something like that. Because it seems like here in Japan, the experience was to really engage in community revitalization. And, I think it was fairly successful. Whereas I think in North America, there's a greater willingness to discard communities as outdated because the technology has moved on or something like that. There's not really a tie to the culture and the place in the same way that maybe there is here. But yeah, it might be interesting to take a look at the case of Yubari City at some point.
Those are all really great examples. Thank you so much. Are there any points that you'd like to add? Any last insights that you feel like you need to share?
If I can emphasize that, the just transition global discussions, I mean, they try hard to bring people into the table by saying, participatory and inclusiveness. And it would be very difficult, I mean, to have dialogue among those different stakeholders. But it would be an extremely tough task. There are already, plenty of substantial changes on the ground happening, right? There are countless bottom-up actions. So the top-down policies, if we need to keep it from the government, they, I think, should support them rather than doing something else. Support them with those contributions, outside in contributions of ideas, knowledges, experience, wisdom of locals, I mean, indigenous women into developing, implementing all those innovative solutions. So supporting would be sufficient. And I believe that could minimize negative impacts and also at the same time maximize equality.
I want to maybe expand on that a little bit, or maybe use, a different term that, for some reason was popular this last year in some of the English language global media, that maybe what needs to happen, rather than having government tell everyone what to do or be very prescriptive, is to create a permission structure that says it's okay to do these things. And if you want to set up a community like this, you want to go into, experiment with different things, we have regulations that allow this to happen. In some ways it's government getting out of the way, but it's also, government being there to lend a hand if it's needed. I think this type of very flexible structure is the way to go. And I think it allows, to continue the metaphor of storytelling from earlier, it allows more people and more communities to start telling their own stories, to become authors in their own lives. And, really, we talk about liberty a lot and having freedom. But I think So Young mentioned this earlier, is that like, okay, so we have some transition, we change energy, but we're not really addressing the issue of overconsumption. We're just saying, okay, if you're going to overconsume so much energy and so much material and stuff, I get, we'll make it a little cleaner. We'll make it a little this, and we're not changing that fundamental story that to be happy is to consume, to be successful is to have conspicuous consumption. Let other people see that you're wearing some brand or, things like that. It allows us to really start to redefine our own values. And so I think that would be an interesting, kind of next step that we could start exploring. Maybe just as an additional resource to mention for people, in talking about theories of justice. Professor from Harvard's Kennedy School, Michael Sandel, on YouTube, you can find his course on justice that he's been teaching for many, many years. It does draw primarily on Western sources of justice, going back to the Greeks, but, modern things, John Rawls, etc., John Stuart Mill. But he does a very good job of laying out theories of justice in an accessible way. And so I think is very, very useful because I think that as we look at just transition, as we see many governments are struggling to understand what a just transition is, to come with a definition, um, at, at the same time as recognizing that there's real urgency for us to respond and to do something quickly to address climate change, to address pollution, biodiversity loss, all of these things. And so one thing that we can start to do is equip ourselves with an understanding of the fundamental ideas that are at play here, so that as we do start taking those step forward, we have a solid foundation, because I think that it could be risky if we just start doing things and don't have a solid grounding. So maybe our role as researchers can be to start providing some of that knowledge to policymakers in accessible ways, so that they can really understand this and be well equipped to create, whether it's those permission structures, policies, whatever they are.
Thank you for listening to About Sustainability. Please subscribe at podcast.iges.jp or search for About Sustainability wherever you normally get your podcasts. If you've got feedback, you can review us on your podcast directory of choice or reach out on Twitter at IGES_EN. About Sustainability is produced by the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. Any views expressed during the podcast are those of the speaker at the time of recording and do not necessarily reflect the views of IGES. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. We don't take that lightly, and we hope you'll join us next time.